it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Bill Glass. A lifetime high achiever, Bill's contribution to the field of occupational health has been recognized around the globe, and he is a founding member of the occupational medicine faculties in London, Australia, and New Zealand, and he's been awarded a multitude of honors. These include Fellow for the Faculty of Occupational Medicine of the Royal College of Physicians of London, Fellow for the Faculty of Occupational Medicine of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, Fellow for the Faculty of Occupational Medicine of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, the New Zealand Commemoration Medal for Services to Occupational Health and Safety, the New Zealand Order of Merit for Services to Occupational Health and Safety. And Bill was also the recipient of the inaugural Air New Zealand Lifetime Achievement Award for New Zealand Workplace Health and Safety. Still very active in the research and application of occupational health and safety in the workplace, Bill is a highly sought-after keynote speaker at seminars and conferences, both in New Zealand and globally. It is wonderful to have a speaker of Bill's caliber here at SIT, and I acknowledge the support from WorkSafe New Zealand and HeadSafe and Gore in making this possible. And please join me now in welcoming Professor Bill Glass.
Very nice, thank you. We just check the sound, okay? Thank you very much. A little bit overdone, of course, but still, these things happen. Let's get organised. The trouble is when you've got these mics on, people know everything you're going to say and they can hear the things you shouldn't say. I thought I'd just start by taking something from Safeguard Update. This is a publication that comes out regularly in New Zealand, put out by Safeguard, and it refers to the comments made by the Minister when he launched WorkSafe's health strategy, and I think outside there's a few things from WorkSafe about it. It is time for us to turn our attention to health and to make sure people that not only stay safe at work but healthy at work. Michael Woodhouse told the 40 or so people gathered for the event. And then he went on to talk about his grandfather, who worked in railway workshops and died, what you would expect people to die, asbestos-related condition. So he said, you know, as an 11-year-old, he really missed out on that contact with his grandfather. And I'll be touching on that issue again a little bit later. The picture on the front, people at work, their health, safety and welfare. And I put the two dates, 1974, 2016. And there we see the Minister of Labour at the time and Bill Jarvie. Now I was very lucky in my 40s to work with a number of companies in Auckland who had people like Bill Jarvie as their general managers. And one day he said to me, look, Bill, he said, I want you to write a book for managers and safety personnel. He said, we'll publish it. And when he said something like, I would like you to do something, you actually took it as an order. So you did it. And it was quite a task, I can tell you. And after a couple of years, he said, well, how's the book coming along, Bill? And I said, well, I'm on the second revision. And he gave me one of those firm looks that he occasionally did, because we ended up great friends, and said, I want it in 3 months' time, and I'll give it to Ron Merrick, our publication guy, and it'll be printed. So there was no choice. So Bill encouraged me to do the book, and he published it, and he wrote the foreword. Now, it's the foreword that I'd like to read to you, and thereafter I won't do too much reading. Although not accounted for in the balance sheet, the most important asset of any enterprise is the people it employs. This investment in people as individuals and as a coordinated team is difficult to measure in monetary terms. An enterprise cannot function without people, and responsible management are well aware of the enormous cost of replacing and training new people. Thus, while the preventive maintenance of plant and machinery is accepted irrespective of cost as being necessary to ensure and maintain productivity, management's prior concern should be care for the people who use this equipment. Apart from all other considerations, management have a social responsibility as one human being does to another, to ensure the health, welfare and safety of the people they employ, and equally the employees in their own interest have a responsibility to cooperate with management. Now, you know, that was to me a fairly important statement, and it was a privilege to work with people like Bill Jarvie and the other general managers that I worked with in that time. And of course it was before the mid-1980s when there was a downturn, and after that time things have changed a lot in New Zealand. There are not many medical officers working in industry, and a lot of the full-time nurses who worked in industry disappeared and became part-time. So things have changed. So what these general managers really told me is that the right attitude is necessary if we're going to deal with health and safety. An attitude that regards people as critical and important. Now we'll get this thing going the right way. Yep. And so I've said here that attitude predetermines workplace culture, and workplace culture drives action. Now, the chairman of WorkSafe has talked a lot about culture, and culture is something hard to change. I mean, there's a lot of comment after Pike River about things like New Zealand's workplace culture is she'll be right. Now, that's got to be buried once and for all. It's not an option. It cannot be an option for the future. It's totally to be buried. We cannot have a she'll be right attitude towards anything anymore in this country if we're going to. We don't see it with the All Blacks, and I'm not a great rugby fan. I think it's a pretty brutal game, but you're all great rugby players down here. And it's not she'll be right with rugby players. I mean, you just need to look at the last test. And they've refined the game of rugby to an extent that I don't think people ever thought could be done before. So if we can do it in one area, surely we can do it in every other area of our lives. Now, just a few words in terms of introduction. I'm going to focus on health issues at work. Having said that, I see health and safety as the two sides of the one coin. They're not separate, they're not in competition with each other. They're the two sides of the one coin, underpinned by welfare, concern for people. Now, work-related health issues are far more deadly than work-related injuries. Every week in New Zealand, there are approximately 2 deaths. We don't know accurately. WorkSafe don't keep precise figures, and it's always arguable what is a workplace and what is not a workplace. But if we assume that there's 2 a week as a rough estimate, then there are 6 to 7 deaths every week from one hazardous substance alone, and that's asbestos. 6 to 7 deaths every week in New Zealand from asbestos, 2 deaths from work accidents. So if we look at the next slide, you can see there how up till about 1972, the sort of coloured verticals there show that the level of deaths from asbestos was somewhere around about 20. Now, at that stage, Bill Birch, who was the Minister of Labour, responded to a lot of pressures to set up a national asbestos register, both for diseases and for people who've been exposed. It was a voluntary register. And how right that decision was, because you can see since 1992 how the deaths from asbestos have gone up. And if you look at the last 10 years, they're running round about an average of 95 to 100. And so it hasn't settled down yet. Now, of course, injury-related deaths attract much more attention. They frequently occur to younger people, people with families, and of course it's extremely tragic. But a 68-year-old man dying of lung cancer because he was exposed to asbestos is also tragic. As the Minister pointed out, you know, he missed out on contact with his grandfather. And what about a 55-year-old woman who gets mesothelioma and dies, and her exposure came from asbestos dust transferred from the workplace to the home by her father, on his clothes, on his hair. He cuddled her as a little girl, and 50 years later she's dead of meso. No publicity for these deaths, no compensation for these deaths, just forget about it. So the health issue is there right in front of our eyes. To focus on deaths though is not enough. We've got to focus on the consequences of illness which are not fatal, and the consequences of injuries which are not fatal. In other words, the disabling effect of non-fatal injuries and illnesses, because these have a terrible impact on the lives not only of the person themselves but of their families. Okay, so there's three issues I want to talk about this evening. The importance of identification of the health issues at work. Probably need to move on a bit. Oh no, we're not up to him yet, so we'll go back. The investigation of the health issues at work and the intervention. The three I's. Identification, investigation, and intervention. You know, there's an act there that people get all uptight about, the new act, but let's concentrate on the fundamentals that are not really dealt with in the act to the same extent. So what do we mean by occupational health? It means a lot of things to a lot of people, and it's misused, in my view, quite a lot now. Everyone says they're a health and safety expert, and when you question where they get their expertise from, well, it's a bit questionable. But that's okay. It's nice that we've got a country full of health and safety experts. But occupational health had a different origin. I mean, it began because human beings were getting illnesses from work. And, you know, in the last century and the century before, these were pretty terrible. Silicosis, lead poisoning, phosphorus poisoning, and then asbestos in about the 1890s, and that's still with us. So occupational health really began as an issue or a discipline that was concerned about the effect of work on health. But about the 1980s that began to change a bit, and we talked or heard talked about the term fitness for work. And so the other side of the coin was put forward. It's not just the effect of work on health, it's also the effect of health on work. And we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. Is it new? Well, it's not that new. See that fellow there? Now, Robert Owen lived in the late 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. He was a mill owner, and he actually owned a town in South Scotland called New Lanark. So he owned the town, he owned the houses, he owned the mill. And at that time, the mill owners in Manchester were shackling the little boys to the machines to stop them running away. That was the stage that we were in not too long ago. So what did Robert Owen do? He decided he wouldn't tie his little boys to the machines, but he would take them away from the factory and educate them. But then he did a couple of other things that caused a little bit of a problem. He set up a prize for the house that was the cleanest house in the village. Well, the housewives thought, who's this guy telling us what we're to do in our homes? It took a little bit of an effort to get that across, but in time, he won the housewives. So he was talking about hygiene, cleanliness at home, cleanliness personally, and cleanliness at work. Education. In other words, long before Bill Jarvie wrote what we just heard him write, Robert Owen was saying just the same things. And this is what he said to his fellow mill owners that the human machine, which they use in their factories, would repay careful treatment and upkeep fully as much as did the inanimate machine. Almost exactly the point Bill Jarvie made, and yet they never knew each other, and I know Bill never read Robert Owen. So it makes you realise that messages are forgotten unless they're repeated, and we have to repeat these messages every generation. There's no certainty that what one generation learns is going to automatically pass on to the next. And I think you can see that in your children, and you probably get all cranky about the way the kids don't do what you were brought up to do, and so on and so forth. So we have to keep relearning these fundamentals. Now, when I had to teach med students down at Otago Medical School, they came mainly from general practice. They had no idea about work. So I developed this concept of the work triangle and the non-work triangle. And so let's just go through that work triangle and see what it can tell us. We've got the worker at the apex of the triangle, and then facing you, we've got the person's job on their right, and where they work on the left, their work environment, their work circumstances, and that can be looked at in terms of chemical, physical, biological, and social aspects. Now you might ask, well, why do we need to separate a person's job from where they do it? We'll take a welder, and you put the welder outside, and he's an electric arc welder, he's welding mild steel. There's no paint on the steel, it's just mild steel, and the wind's blowing. Is he going to be affected by inhalation of the fumes from the welding? And the answer is obviously not. Why? Because the welding fumes are diluted by the ventilation, the natural ventilation outside. Now you put that same welder doing the same job, and you put him in here, or a smaller room, which you often find welders in. And are the fumes going to affect their respiratory system? Yes, they are. And why? Because the concentration of the fume is increased. And why has that occurred? Because it's confined space and the change in air are limited. So we see straight away that circumstances often determine the consequences, and that the circumstances of work are as important as the actual work process itself. Now let's look at the next slide here. And here we see Bernardino Ramazzini, an Italian who wrote the first classical book on occupational medicine in 1700. And the portrait is done by a long-term friend of mine, Anthony Stones, who did a lot of portrait sculptures and big sculptures around New Zealand, a lot of watercolours, but he was traditional. He came from England. The art establishment didn't really like what he did. He went back to England and became a portrait sculptor there, and then he met a Chinese lady, and he had a huge career in China, and he died this year. So Tony was a good friend, and this portrait of Ramazzini is now being used by an Italian occupational physician on the cover of a book he's just written. And Ramazzini spoke about confined space in that book. So there we have 1700, and here we are 2016, and the same messages are being repeated time and time and time again. Okay, so what about the non-work triangle? Well, we go back to our welder, and we find our welder if we look at the mirror image of work. Go on to the next one. It's recreation. And so what are the things that in recreation can affect, say, the lungs in this case, because we're considering the lungs in terms of the welding fumes? Well, smoking cigarettes, smoking pot, perhaps having a hobby that exposes them to more dust at work. Perhaps the person's got asthma, had asthma since childhood. It's not properly treated. Perhaps that person lives in a house, like so many New Zealand houses, badly insulated, cold, damp, mould, and maybe with asbestos ceiling, which is disintegrating after 40 or 50 years, and you're getting some fallout. So suddenly we see the whole person, don't we? We see the person at work, and we see the person away from work, and we see how the interaction of the non-work factors can react with the work factors and vice versa. And I was talking to the safety committee this morning at SIT, and I used an example, some lead workers. Now, I worked for Lucas Industries years ago in Onehunga in Auckland, and they made batteries, and the big hazard was lead. And the battery factory was in a designated heavy industry sector of Onehunga, but prior to that it had been a housing area. So all around the factory were houses. And a lot of the workers were migrant. They were the early migrants from Tonga, Samoa, and migrant workers live close to where they work because they don't have transport and they don't have funding. And one day, 3 of the women from houses across the road came in to see the nurse at the factory and said, "Look, nurse, we're very worried." In the weekend, the Tongan supervisor ran the smelter, it was a secondary smelter. The guys would all walk across the road in their work clothes, in their work boots, lead dust falling off their bodies, clothes rather, and have morning tea and lunch and afternoon tea. And there were some little kids in the family, and the mothers said, "Look, we had to take our kid to the doctor," and the doctor didn't know what was wrong because the child's not eating, it's got stomach pains. Well, we knew straight away what was wrong, it was getting lead poisoning. So, here we hear this interrelationship between work and non-work, and we did a study involving all the families doing blood leads on the wives and the children, found that there was a lot of transfer of lead from the factory into the homes, and the company set up a double showering system so you couldn't get your home clothes at the end of the workday unless you went through the showers to get them, and so that reduced the problem. So we have to see the worker in a holistic sense, and so I developed the term the Bill Glass Triangle to get this method across to the doctors when I was teaching them. And now, of course, this has assumed huge proportions internationally. We had a speaker out from the States 3 or 4 years ago, and what's happening now in some of the bigger companies, they're realising that it's not workplace injuries, it's not workplace illnesses that's causing most of the production costs from absenteeism and what they call presenteeism. It's general health issues. It's things like hypertension, diabetes, work, socially related things like diet and overweight, smoking, drinking. It's these general health issues that are causing the biggest cost to production. And so what's happening there with the insurance company-based approach they have there, private insurance companies, if they turn on in-house health education programs for these non-work related issues, then the premiums get cut. Now, it might be a long time before this happens here because the reaction you get in New Zealand is, well, they should go and see their GP. But that doesn't work anymore. GPs have 10 minutes to see a patient mostly. And then the nurse knocks on the door, the nurse manager said, get to see the next patient. They don't have time to do health education. They don't have the ability to talk to a group of people. So things are changing, and that's why the WorkSafe board chairman, Gregor Costa, is running a seminar in Wellington this month on wellness, because this is a term I'm not terribly fond of, but still we use it, and we have an even worse term called unwellness, which I think is a dreadful term. But it's focusing on the fact that general health issues are a big issue in the workplace. And although Gregor makes it clear this is not the role of WorkSafe, WorkSafe is a regulator, nevertheless it's an important issue in occupational health. Now, let's have a look at the identification of the hazard. Now, firstly, I think we can assume that we basically know what the major issues are at work. We've known for years. We've known that noise is a problem. we've known that musculoskeletal issues, strains and sprains, whatever you like to call them, are problems. And they're the two biggest accepted claims by ACC in New Zealand by far. Then third on the list comes respiratory conditions, asbestos of course being the biggest one, and then you get things like asthma, and then as you go down the list you get things like dermatitis and so on and so forth. One of the illnesses that developed out of that NOD system, which the department ran very well from 1992 to 1997, and then it's just sort of folded since, was that it revealed a relatively new for New Zealand disease, chronic solvent neurotoxicity. That is the effect of solvents on the brains of the people who inhale and get their skin covered in solvents. And the Centre for Public Health Research, where I do a little bit of work, we've now got a study going on this, and I was in Barcelona 10 days ago, where my wife was talking on motor neurone disease and Sam Keir was talking on solvent neurotoxicity. They're both doing their PhDs. And so he was concentrating on the collision repair industry, where young guys are going there, and we get back to the point of Robert Owen, often not much good mothering, often not very good personal hygiene, not very good work hygiene, sometimes long hours, not knowing that solvents can be absorbed through the skin, cleaning their hands at the end of the day by using some leftover solvent. And I've spoken to young managers who've been running these businesses for 10 years, and one in particular I remember meeting in Picton, and he said, look, I can't run this business anymore, I'm only 32, but I've been a spray painter since I'm 18, car repair spray painter. He said, my wife has to do the books. I can't remember things, 32. Now this is dreadful, and we'll talk about that later. So identification of the hazard then, we know, but sometimes it's useful to have one or two examples. Oh yes, now these are upper limb process claims. Now it took me a week working with someone who knew far more about statistics than me to produce this. And you know, I wrote it down by hand, I'm no good on computers, but you can see that over 2 years we've straight away got some information. Let's have a look at the construction industry, and you can see that 20% of these types of upper limb musculoskeletal claims were related to the shoulder, 18% to the elbow, and 11% to the hand and wrist. Similarly, quite similar patterns in the service industry, although much less in the hand wrist. We go to the meat processing industry, important down here, and we find the hand wrist is 15%, the shoulder only 5%, and elbow 12%. Then you go to farming, and the shoulder comes more important. And if you go to the, we haven't got it here, but if you go to the forestry industry, it's shoulders that loom up as the big problem. So even a simple review of 2 years accepted claims can focus the issue that we know is there more precisely and identify the sort of thing that we should be looking at more carefully. Now the next one, of course, is one we all know about, but these are the two big issues, of course, as I said, noise and overuse, and that speaks for itself. ACC have changed the pattern a little, but by raising the bar, it's a bit harder now to get a noise-induced hearing loss accepted than before, so the results look as if they're getting better, but I suspect they haven't changed much. Now here's another one, vibration white finger. We got it there. A few years ago, I said, well, look, this seems to be pretty important, and I was talking to some people in the Department of Labour, and someone said, oh, Bill Glass is going bloody nuts, you know. We don't have that. It used to be a problem in the forestry industry. We don't have it anymore. So I thought, let's try it out. And we had a simple questionnaire. We sent down to the civil construction people. We got the WorkSafe inspectors just to hand out a simple questionnaire, yes, no type thing, and you can see straight away. that 1 in 3 or 4 of the respondents indicated a possible diagnosis of vibration white finger. And so now WorkSafe are going to focus on that. Now, this is not a killing disease, but to end up with your fingers numb and painful and tingling, you know, you can drop things if your fingers don't feel good. Fingers are quite important. So it's not the top of the list, but it's important. So we know that, and we've got to focus on looking at some of those conditions in a bit more detail. A workplace checklist. Now, I spoke with the safety committee this morning about this. Do you go around and do a WorkSafe walkthrough? How many of the companies do this on a regular basis? Maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. Do they get the WorkSafe manager to do it? Do they get the safety person to do it, who perhaps looks at things with new eyes? Or do they get a worker representative to do it? Because when you're living and working in an environment, you don't always see the issues that are in front of your eyes. And a fresh pair of eyes can be quite helpful. And if you look at the workplace in terms of its physical characteristics, remember we talked about the circumstances of work, so all we're doing is reflecting the circumstances of work in this checklist. So we're looking at the physical characteristics of the workplace, chemical issues, biological issues where they're appropriate, and then things like personal issues and social and administration. Now, there's just another issue we're going for at a time here. Another one I want to talk about briefly, absenteeism. Now, absenteeism, you ask a lot of companies what's the biggest costs, and they say, oh, it's salaries, it's, you know, employment's the biggest cost. Do you know when people are at work and not at work? Oh, well, I'm not sure about that. We have some figures. Do you ever look at them? Oh, not really. So why do you keep them? Maybe you keep them solely to make sure they get paid or not paid. But there's another reason to keep absence figures, and that's to look at why people are not at work. So let's have a look at some of the questions that we could ask. What can it tell us? It can tell us who's absent. It can tell you where, what part of the factory they're absent from. It can tell you when they're absent from work. Now, why is Joe away every third Thursday and Friday? It can tell you how often. Is there a pattern? Is there something that you need to look at? Because remember, we're focusing on health now, not just on work-related issues. How long they're away, and then why. And is this useful? So I just put that up for you as a thought. And of course, it can help with our identification. So let's now move to the next stage, which will speed up a bit. Investigation. Is the hazard a health risk? Now, one of the important things is dose. Dose is the determinant. What determines dose? The amount or quantity of exposure, or in terms of occupation, over the amount of use. The time and frequency. It's not sufficient to just say, oh, well, I've been working with asbestos for a year. They may have been working with asbestos for a year, but it might only be 1 day a week. So we want to find out what the exposure is, the frequency, the intensity of work. You know, if you have someone sitting in an office, their breathing rate is maybe 6 or 7 litres a minute. You have someone digging a hole or working hard, their breathing rate can be 40 to 50 litres a minute. So if there's contaminants in the air, who's going to inhale most of the contaminants? The person working hard, not the person working less hard. Now, at this point, I thought I'd just give you 1 or 2 case histories because they add a little more to the words. Now, the first is a chap who got lung cancer from asbestos, and he was a carpenter. Now, in the 1960s, skill saws came into the construction industry. Up till then it was hand saws. The amount of dust produced by a hand saw far less than the amount of dust produced by a fast revving skill saw. And it's from that point on that the asbestos-related disease became a real issue in the construction industry. So this man got cancer of the lung. So the first thing was to take a careful history. What was his exposure after a lifetime? And by sitting down with him, he's an Invercargill guy actually. I went to see him in his home because he was always already homebound, bedridden. It worked out he'd had about 200 hours a year of asbestos cement dust exposure over the 20 years between 1962 and 1982. Was he a smoker? The medical officer from the ACC at the time tried to say his lung cancer was due to smoking, because that's obviously a cause of smoking, and lung cancer from smoking and lung cancer from asbestos, exactly the same sort of lung cancer in every way, in its location and the type of cell. You can't separate them. Did he smoke? Well, yeah, most young guys probably had a cigarette. But he was also an active sportsman, and he said, I might have had a few cigarettes, in my teens, but not after that. So in effect, he wasn't a smoker. It took a year before we could get his claim accepted, you wouldn't believe it. And so he had about 6 months to spend the money and get his house done for his wife. Now that was a long latency case, and I said earlier I would talk to you about latency and occupational disease. The argument that's constantly put forward is that occupational disease is in the too hard basket because it's all long latency. And what can you do about something that happened in the past? And what do I mean by long latency? I mean the time from first exposure to the appearance of the disease. Now with asbestos it might be 30 or 40 or 50 years. So of course you can't do anything about the past. And so this concept that occupational diseases are all long latency and you can't do anything about it, why worry about it, is a load of bollocks. So let's look at the next case, and this is also an Invercargill person, and he was a house painter. And in 1983 he bought 2 houses to do up, and it took a lot of sanding, and he used a disc sander. He didn't wear a mask, and he did about 160 hours. Once again, I was getting a dose from him, you see, working out how many hours he'd done by getting his careful work history. He developed stomach pains and unexpected tiredness. Well, now these are common conditions, and so if you go and see a doctor, the doctor's not going to think you've got lead poisoning, because that's the least thing that's going to be in his head. Because remember, doctors get 6 hours training in occupational health in 6 years. So the last thing they're going to know about is work-related diseases. And the last question they're going to ask is the question that Ramazzini first asked, what is your occupation? So anyway, the next year he didn't do this work and he was okay. And in 1985, he bought 3 houses. It was a busy year. He did 200 plus hours of sanding down. He felt extremely tired and he was very irritable. His dose had increased. The symptoms were still non-specific. There was no way the doctor was going to get onto it. In 1986-87, he worked on 4 houses involving 180 hours of sanding down. Now, the last house he worked on was tenanted, and the tenant told him that the cat had been diagnosed by the vet with lead poisoning. And this is often the case. The cat gets poisoned before the person because the cats go licking at everything and there's lead all over the ground and so on and so forth. And so by this time, the penny dropped, so he went and demanded his doctor give him a lead test, and sure enough, he had lead poisoning, and it affected his peripheral nerves. He had foot drop and loss of sensation in his lower limbs. And once again, we had a hell of a battle with the ACC to get them to accept gradual process claims because they find it very difficult to understand that. So here we had no long latency. As you can see, the symptoms developed within the year. It wasn't a long latency disease. Now, the third case is a fiberglasser. Now, this guy came to see me when I was at the med school in Dunedin. He was referred directly by a GP, and he rang up and I said, well, I want you to bring your wife. And he said, why? I said, I'm not telling you why, you just bring her. And so she came along, and they sat there, and I was chatting to him, and I said, you know, how have you been? And I've been all right, nothing wrong with me. And, you know, what's your mood like? Mood, he said, nothing wrong with my mood. And I could see his wife getting a little bit uncomfortable and jigging around in the chair a bit. And what's your memory like? Oh, Christ, nothing wrong with my memory, doctor. Well, she leapt out of a chair and she stormed up and she hammered the desk and she said, doctor, don't believe the silly old fool. She said, I give him a list to go down to the dairy. He either loses the list or forgets half the things that's on the list. And then she told me this story. She said, he comes home from work. Now, he was a fiberglasser, and he used methylene chloride to clean his fiberglass gun at the end of the day. And she said, he smells of that solvent. She said, his clothes stink. His hair stinks. So I make him have a shower. But she said, at night, you see, we've only got a small bedroom. They lived in a wee house in St Kilda. And his breath is so bad. So I make him sleep away, with his face away from me. Now, she said, on his side of the bedroom, we had a tall boy, a varnished tall boy. But she said, you won't believe it, that over a year, the varnish on the tall boy turned milky. He was quietly paint stripping the varnish on the tall boy with his breath. Now, you see, this tells us a hang of a lot about solvents. Firstly, he inhaled it, but secondly, it isn't absorbed through the skin, so that it comes out through the skin at night. So his skin smelt terribly at night. It was awful to be in bed with the stink coming out of his skin. But the solvent is not all broken down in the body. Some of it is exhaled unchanged. And so that was happening during the night. Some of the unchanged methylene chloride was being blown out of his system, out of his bloodstream, back into his lungs, out into there, and changing the varnish on there. So it told, I use this for the students because it tells you a lot about how something behaves in the body, what we call the toxicokinetics. Now that was a pretty short latency, wasn't it? This wasn't too hard basket. So then we come to the last one, and this happened only a little while ago. And this is a very short late. It concerned a farm worker who over 4 or 5 days developed a severe headache, limb pain, marked sweating, which tended to occur at a certain time in the evening. He became rapidly ill. He said his urine turned black, what we call in cows black water. A friend looking at him said, you look as if you're running on empty. On day 5 he had a rigor. He was confused, admitted to hospital down here. It's another local case, of course. A blood test confirmed leptospirosis, acute leptospirosis. Now, any doctor worth his salt living in a farming area faced with someone with a flu-like illness that's got a pattern of regularity like that and doesn't think of leptospirosis. You see, once again, the question wasn't asked, what is your occupation? And having asked, you should have made the diagnosis straight away. So this was a very short latency, maybe a week or two. So these cases illustrate that occupational disease is not a long latency disease only. It is not too difficult, but you need to ask the question, what do you do? And then you've got to have some knowledge about that. So we're getting near the end. I'm probably running a bit late, but that's all right. We've done the case studies. So we come to intervention. And there are 4 headings here. Control at source, PPE, monitoring exposure and monitoring personal absorption, and maintenance. Very simple, 4 headings, that's all you need to do. So if you say you've got a carpenter shop and you've got a lot of wood dust, and remember now wood dust is regarded as a carcinogen. And so you want to control it at source, and you can do a walk-through survey. You can see where the main dusty points are. Then you can put a local exhaust system in at the point of production of the highest level of dust. You don't then spend heaps of money doing a general ventilation system, which doesn't really work. You're doing local ventilation at the point of highest production. Now, some people say, well, yes, control at source, that's where we should be focusing on PPP, that's the second line of defence or the last line of defence. Well, I don't agree with that. I think, you know, you can walk through life on one leg and that's stumbling through life. Or you can walk through life on two legs and you make a bit of progress. So let's look at control at source and PPE as two legs, both rather than one and not the other, because control at source is never 100% and PPE is never 100%. That's why we're getting fit testing now for PPE, because people put it on with beards and it doesn't work. So you're better to use what I call the belt and braces approach than to rely on one alone. Then you need to make sure that the systems are working by monitoring, seeing that the exposure levels have been controlled and that the PPE is actually working and the person's not absorbing anything, if you can do a blood test or a lung function test. And finally, maintenance. Now, my first job with the Department of Health was in 1959, and I was driving up to Auckland, and that afternoon at King's Wharf, on the waterfront in Auckland, there was an ammonia explosion. A pipe burst, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The guys were upstairs in the shower. The liquid ammonia, of course, in the pipe burst, it vaporizes rapidly, fills up the space, up the stairs, into the shower. 2 died, 3 to 4 were admitted to hospital. Their lungs burnt by the ammonia, their skin burnt. I've got photographs, I don't show them anymore, they're so terrible. Now, that was the event, the burst pipe. But what were the circumstances? The circumstances were that it was 4 in the afternoon, that the wind was blowing off the sea down into the open doors of the shed. This took the cloud of ammonia gas up the stairs into the shower. So you can see how all the circumstances worked to make the burst pipe far worse. If it had happened at night, it wouldn't have been a problem. So circumstances are always so critical. Now, I got there in the health department next day and I was told that's my first job. I went down there, you could put your finger through the steel pipe. It was so thin. So that brings us to the last point, maintenance. There is no use with introducing controls at source, no use putting in PPEs, if you don't maintain. I used to do a lot of seminars around the place with New Zealand Safety, and I worked with a guy, Ross, who was the safety manager, and he had these masks that had the same filter in them for 20 years. Earmuffs that had lost all their resilience and had no effect. So maintenance, I think, is probably almost top of that list. Okay, we're nearly finished. Your turn to talk. So we conclude. From my point of view, attitude is critical. The right attitude towards health and safety. Without it, all the regulations in the world are not going to achieve what you want to achieve. Knowledge is essential. And here, you know, is a plug for SIT. You and Invercargill have got a resource here where you offer free training worldwide and New Zealand-wide, and there's nothing like it. And it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Listen to what people say. Look. And listen and looking is all about a workplace walking through the workplace. You listen and you look. And finally, action. You know, none of this stuff is any good. People who come and tell me they went to a great seminar, if no action comes out of the seminar, what's the point of going? You know, we're just listening, we're not learning. So the ultimate end is not knowledge, but action. To be half right on time may be more important than to obtain the whole truth too late. And that was a wise old fellow called Aristotle. And then the last of all, I can't read this very well. This is the tall poppy emblem, is a metaphor for excellence and endeavour. It symbolises a country's pride in its outstanding achievers in all fields of endeavour. Now, I went to hear one of probably the best student I ever taught, Michael Donoghue, who was giving an address when he got his PhD in Queensland, and I went over to the conference. And this was the symbol that they had at the conference. You know, what are we known for in New Zealand? Chopping off the heads of tall poppies. We love doing it, don't we? We love chopping people's heads off if they get too far above the group. And the Australians, they value them. Now, I think we can go a step further, and I can say to you, all of you who are committed and passionate about health and safety at work, you are all tall poppies. So thanks very much.
We do have some time for questions. If anybody's got a question, you just got to give me time to get the mic to you. So does anybody have any questions for Dr. Glass? You're all very shy.
Surely I haven't answered all the problems. There's someone new.
Yes, Wade Devine. Leptospirosis, that's a disease that has been around for many years. And a lot of as you say, a lot of doctors don't seem to know about it and are very slow to diagnose it. Has that improved? That, you know, when people come in with that sort of stuff, especially, I know a vet that basically had to diagnose himself because a medical person missed it.
You see, one of the problems, and I've got to talk negatively about my profession sometimes. Firstly, how much training do they get in occupational health? You know, 10 hours at the most at Auckland or Dunedin Medical School. Well, who's interested in 10 hours lectures? You know, they all want to be GPs, they all want to know about clinical medicine. They don't want to hear about this sort of stuff. When they get through, or even when they go to the, say, learn about kidney disease or learn about lung function, do they get taught about the work-related causes of lung function? No. So even the physicians who train them don't teach them. So I've got some thoughts on this, and maybe now having a bit of an association with SIT we can look at it. But one of my thoughts was, look, we tend to focus on the wrong issues. Now, what did Ramazzini focus on? He focused on occupational diseases related to particular occupations, whereas we tend to focus generically on noise or dust. What we should be doing is saying, what are the risks of being a carpenter? What are the health risks of being a checkout girl? What are the health risks of being a baker? And I started to draft this up in 202, just one pages, and I got a young girl to do some typing for me. And I tried to sell it to the ACC, no. Department of Labour, no. GPs, no. And yet it's so simple. You know, these days they all got computers. All they need to do is say, what are you? And the person says, well, I'm a checkout girl. They type in checkout, up comes a page and says, these are the problems. How simple could life be? But it's still seen as too hard for this country. Now, I think we should forget about the GPs and look at doing this for the occupational health nurses and looking at doing it for managers. You know, so managers know, and health and safety people know, that if they're running a construction industry, then the issues that they've got to look at for their carpenters and their fitters and their welders and so on and so forth, these are the health issues. And make knowledge much more simple and more focused. So maybe we've got to look at that one. So it's a good question. Thanks for that.
Well, I've got a question actually that relates a little bit to the leptospirosis one. What's the best place to go and find out information about things like leptospirosis and that? I found it really difficult to find someone to answer questions.
This is what about lepto?
Lepto is one of them. We have staff that work in areas where E. coli is an issue, and
Yes.
I'm wanting to ask questions about what kind of things
Campylobacter is another one.
exactly should
Yep.
we be doing for them. And
Yeah.
I find it like public health I went to, but that wasn't helpful for me. So where do you
Okay.
go? What's the best place to ask?
Terry,
The
I think
questions.
we'll set up an information service. I think that's,
Yeah, it's just
no,
it's-
I'm saying it quite seriously.
Yeah,
It's not
it's-
difficult, and you've suggested sort of a library type thing. So there are good publications. I mean,
Right.
if you can email me,
Sure.
Bill Office, BILLOFFICE @exeter.co.nz. There's a very good Department of Labour publication. It's old, it's been around for about 12 years, but it's still incredibly useful.
Yep.
And you send it to me, that address in the meantime.
Yeah. I agree with what you're saying about the occupation, by a baker, whatever,
Yes.
because there's a lot. I've also in the past worked in supermarkets, and we had some of those kind of structures for, where you're working in a checkout. Well, these are the kind of things that we're looking at
Well,
that
it
are
makes sense,
issues.
doesn't it?
Of course it
'Cause
does.
it makes
Absolutely.
common sense. And,
Thank-
occupational medicine is common sense.
Yeah.
It's not a complicated thing at all.
Thank you.
All right, there we are. Time, gentlemen and ladies. So,
questions, or-
cheerio, all you tall poppies.
So just before Professor Glass disappears, he's alluded to it a little bit. The Southern Institute of Technology, I head up Sit to Learn, our distance online education faculty, and we have just recently, last week I think it was, received approval and accreditation from the NZQA to add a major to our Bachelor of Applied Management for Occupational Health and Safety Management. So we'll be adding to that portfolio a Bachelor of Applied Management for Occupational Health and Safety Management and a graduate diploma and a graduate certificate in Occupational Health and Safety Management, which we're very excited about. The other thing that I'm very excited to announce, it's just been confirmed, is that SIT is going to house the Professor Bill Glass Occupational Health and Safety Collection within the SIT library, and making an extremely invaluable resource readily available to students and the public. So for that, I thank Bill very much.
Okay, thank you.
And
Thank you.
thank you all again for coming tonight. I
Yeah.
hope you've enjoyed it and learned as much
Yeah,
as I
okay.
had.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay. She got me just in time.